Okay, welcome to our episode. We are talking about science and God's existence. Again, my name is Mark Clark. We have
Dominic.
Dina.
All right, we're going to jump into this science and existence of God. A massive topic. Lots of questions came in regard to, why is it contradictory to Christianity, all that stuff. So first question out of the gate was, are there conflicts between scientific evidence and religious doctrines? So how do we start into this kind of wading into the water of science and the existence of God? Any of you guys want to jump into this?
I will front by saying that I was homeschooled, and so my science education is lacking. But my philosophical education is strong. And so I'm going to approach this from talking about the philosophy of science, which people maybe don't even think about that.
Right.
They think like there's the scientific method.
Right.
There is the scientific method, but there's different versions of the scientific method that have philosophical underpinnings. So I think the answer to whether there are scientific problems with what the scripture says really depends on where you're approaching the philosophical side of this question. So I think first and foremost, you have to start with the question, is science something that should be neutral in terms of the existence of God? And so classic science would say, we don't start out from assuming God's existence. You can just start out from a question. Perhaps God exists, perhaps God does not exist. Let's go out into the material world and let's explore what the world says and see whether it emerges with any evidence for the existence of God or not. And I feel like when you approach science from that neutral standpoint, then you will find a lot to consider in Christianity. If, on the other hand, you're approaching science and you're saying science must operate from the assumption that God does not exist, that's going to yield a completely different answer.
Which is a philosophical
you're getting
starting
to
point, not a scientific one. So ergo, you're cutting off the branch you're kind of sitting on.
And it's one that going out and searching the material world could never actually substantiate because God is not a material being. And so
it's a category mistake to look at the natural world and try to deduce things about a supernatural being.
Right.
What Stephen Jay Gould said, these are non-overlapping magisteria.
Right.
We have to stop saying, well, I looked in the garden and it went, oh my gosh, God doesn't exist because the way bones work or whatever. And it's like, what? Why are these are completely different categories we talk about. So yeah.
And I think, it's not a crazy viewpoint. There is a reason people would say science should operate from the assumption that God does not exist. And that is because of the fear of the God of the gaps argument. Sure. So a scientist with that viewpoint might say, if we leave it open for God to exist, then as scientists, we're not going to be rigorous in our pursuit of discovery and trying to find a material answer. We're just going to say, well, I guess God did that.
Yeah.
But I think the history of science actually says something different. There have been wonderful, accomplished scientists who've believed in the existence of God, but have been able to apply rigorous pursuit of the scientific method to find good answers to scientific questions.
Yes.
And then the opposite is true. There have been scientists who are either agnostic or atheistic, and they've been able to be quite successful. So I would say the right approach here is to say, we don't know whether God exists in terms of this big question. And let's go out and let's study this question rather than just demanding that science start from an assumption that God does not exist.
Yeah. And if you truly have a heart for science and believe in the scientific process, then you're going to want to be open to the new evidence that presents itself. When we were living in England, I had a chance to meet Richard Dawkins. If you've never heard of him, world's most famous atheist. But his science oftentimes veers into scientism, which becomes a worldview or philosophical argument. And I was at this seminar that he was doing, and he opened it up for Q&A, and someone asked him, they're like, is there anything, Professor Dawkins, that would change your mind? And anything that we could bring to this court of a classroom that would sway your view of God. Right. And his response was so telling because he's like, no, there's nothing. Like if I suddenly saw God appear before me, I'd want to go see my psychiatrist, or I'd want to bring God into the lab and dissect him. Or if I saw Yahweh in the clouds, I'd write it off as some, psychotic episode. There's literally nothing that would change his mind, which of course shows us that his science in that case isn't falsifiable. Never a good thing when it comes to science. So how we approach it and being open to, okay, what are some of the signposts that would point to the existence of God and demonstrate his reality in our life. So
Richard Lewontin, there's a quote where he talks about we can't let a divine foot in the door at the beginning of let's any inquiry we do, let's make sure we don't ever use God as a reason, to your point about the God and the gaps. So let's show, let's demonstrate a bit of the false dichotomy of this. People have through history gone, well, faith and science are at odds with each other, and the problem of God. I talk about the myth of the church versus science. And I talk about the idea that another example of this is historical revisionism by skeptics, is the story of the medieval church believing that the Bible taught a flat earth and then reacting in outrage when science came along and proved the Bible was wrong. It's simply not true. From the time of the ancient Greeks, people knew the earth was round. They observed that the hull of a ship sailed from shore disappears before the top of the mast, would see the reflection of the earth on the moon during an eclipse. They knew the earth was round. The so-called flat earth conflict is simply part of the 19th century propaganda. So Oxford professor, one of your buds, Alistair McGrath, concludes rightly, the idea that science and religion are in perpetual conflict is no longer taken seriously by any major historian of science. It's one of the last remaining bastions of atheism which survives only at the popular level, the internet. Namely, the myth that an atheistic faith-based science is permanently at war with a faith-based religion. It's just not true, and it's never been true. And so we have to point out that the great universities of the Western world, whether it's Harvard or Brown or Yale or whatever, they were born out of a Christian worldview. Seminaries trying to bring the idea of God into things. The modern scientific method was born out of Christian conviction. It was Christian scientists, the Francis Bacons of the world, all these people who are like, we have to study the world and it has order. These are all Judeo-Christian convictions versus, say, like Buddhism or animism. If animism was true, then every time you poke at a tree, you're like poking at a live spirit being. So it didn't give way to the hypothesis, now we'll do a test, now we'll do verification. It doesn't give way to that. Where Christianity becomes like the garden out of which the modern world is built. And so even on a philosophical level, I call it the Plantinga effect in the Problem of God, where overnight this guy, the most famous living philosopher of our time, is actually a Christian. He's a theist. And what has happened over the course of the last 30 years or so on university campuses is it's what he calls the desecularization of philosophy. And it's that a lot of these philosophy departments are being overwhelmed by theists away from secularism because they're realizing the legitimacy of guys like Plantinga and Polkinghorne and these actual scientists who are Christians, the John Lennoxes of the world. There are thinking people who are some of the greatest scientists of our time. And they're actually theists. Talk about that.
The guy that cracked the genome code, he is a Christian.
Francis Collins. No, Francis Crick cracked it, but he played out the whole human genome. Yes.
And so that's one of the lesser told stories. I think as you dive into a Dawkins, and I think it's really important. I'm thinking of someone who's listening who is a scientist, and they have received this belief that when they, for example, go into a lab, they need to take their Christianity and put it on a shelf. That's not how science was born. I think it's Rodney Stark, I think you were sharing, who chronicled how it was actually Christians' belief in the reasonability of the world based on the orderliness and the reason of God himself that birthed the scientific method and brought science to the forefront of culture. So as a scientist, you don't have to go into the lab and put your faith on a shelf. Rather, it is your faith that should motivate you to do your work very, very well, to think this is an orderly universe and there is probably a reasonable explanation in this cause and effect. And it's my job to study it and look for a discovery, an answer to a question. And that whole pursuit is something that can be sanctioned by your faith motivated by your faith and even helped by your faith.
Absolutely. I mean, historically, that is the case. When you look at the list of people who their Christianity informed their science, it's crazy. Galileo, Johann Kepler, Blaise Pascal, Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, Michael Faraday. I mean, this crazy list. But it was their belief in God. Far from being a hindrance to science, it was actually their main inspiration for it.
Yeah.
John Lennox, he wrote a book a number of years ago, Has Science Buried God? And he points out that Isaac Newton, when he discovered the laws of gravitation, he didn't say, oh, wonderful, I don't need God anymore.
Right.
But rather, he said the opposite, like, what a wonderful God to have invented such a beautiful thing. And he wrote the Principia Mathematica. And in his introduction to that, he says, my goal here is to point people towards God. So it was the belief in a creator that animated and informed their science.
That's so good. I will say, though, as someone that had to do a report, I think in the 7th grade on the Scopes trial, I do understand culturally, especially in America, where this idea comes from that religion is pitted against science. Because I think there have been many cultural conversations where perhaps people who have not been exposed to the history of science and some better understandings of the way science can operate with our faith have just basically said that is opposite what the Bible says, and therefore science is wrong.
Yes, it's a culture war framing
Yes.
of us versus science.
And-
partly our own
And
doing.
that's how it's painted. It's the Bible versus science.
Yeah.
And I think as Christians, it's important for us as much as possible to resist that debate because it's an oversimplification. And a lot of times it's about how people interpret the Bible, how people interpret science. And it needs to be a careful conversation instead of just a crazy
You're
conversation.
pointing out like the great irony there too, though, that actually the majority of Americans, according to Pew Research a couple years ago, they said that 55% of Americans believe there is a conflict between science and religion. But they come at it from two different perspectives. So you have the Peter Atkins, the Christopher Hitchens, Richard Dawkins, who are saying science is the enemy of faith. But also we have to acknowledge there's the other voice on the other side that is deeply, deeply suspicious about science. And, you know, whether it's new scientific discoveries or conversations about the age of the earth. And so there is within Christianity, some sectors of Christianity.
There's not one
church
monolithic thing called science.
Yeah.
And then it's just decided a bunch of stuff and it's all been right. And we're in conflict with it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think our posture towards science really needs to be three things. Like we first of all, we recognize the limitations of science. We celebrate the discoveries of science, and we engage with the deeper issue of worldview. And you mentioned Alvin Plantinga. He wrote an amazing book on this topic called Where the Conflict Really Lies. And he argues there that it's not between religion and Christianity, faith or religion and science. Rather, the true conflict is between atheism, worldview, versus theism. Let's engage that issue because when you look at science, it's exciting. Whether it's the microscope or telescope, it reveals the heart of God, the beauty of God, the mystery of God. What an amazing God to have created such an incredible world. That's why I think as followers of Jesus, we ought to be leaders in the science. All things are yours, Paul says. Biology, chemistry, psychology, philosophy. It's all yours. So enjoy this beautiful world he's made.
That's good.
Coming back to the concept of sitting down for coffee with a friend and having this discussion, you brought up the Scopes trial and Darwinism or evolution, you know, that kind of stuff, and the culture war that was. And I remember even just as a tool maybe for you watching this, to think about it almost philosophically. So none of us, I mean, I don't know when last time you did your biology was and how many bones you've ripped open and actually read Darwin. I'm sure it's your morning reading. He was obviously a very smart guy, but I think taking it from more of a philosophical conversation, you know, your background is helpful too, because the person watching, I don't know how scientific you actually are, but I remember reading a book a few years ago by a guy named Mitch Stokes, and he talked about the idea of the contradiction of cognitive faculties, which is basically if the conclusion is this, if evolution is actually like no God involved, just naturalistic evolution was the way things happened, then you can't actually trust your own conclusion because from what naturalism says is everything is the way it is, born out of trying to survive and what's pragmatic in the moment to survive. So our bodies adapted over time to survival and making sure that our seed gets into the next generation. Everything that happens, the way our brains work, just follow this argument for a sec. So everything that happens isn't about what's true and right, it's about what works. So now we have this belief in God, and the naturalist says, well, that's just some wiring from some hope from some weak person that you have to believe in God or whatever. But what we would say back is, well, they would say, I would say, well, my cognitive faculties kind of over time created this belief in God. But if evolution is true, then the only way you think what you think is, it was just based on we're an animal and we're trying to survive. So, ergo, as Darwin said, I can't trust my thoughts because who can trust the convictions of a monkey's mind? That was his quote. Well, if that's true, then yes, you're right. I can't trust the convictions of my mind about God, but I also can't trust my convictions about science.
Right.
I can't trust my convictions about evolution because those thoughts have been driven only with what's pragmatic and with what works, so you can't trust them. And Darwin came to that very point where he said, the matrix I'm in that I can't get out of, the self-contradiction I'm in is if I'm right, and we are from monkeys, I can't even trust my own conclusions.
Right.
So this is the philosophical piece that I think is important, rather than getting into like, oh, look at this chicken bone and look at the wing and how it's... It's like, wait a minute. If what you're saying is true, we can't even know if it's true. There's a philosophical conversation to be had about a lot of this that I think is important.
Yeah,
So.
I mean, Darwin is such an interesting character because he actually started out training to be a priest.
Yeah.
And then abandoned that. He went, I think, to Cambridge and was studying the medical world. And when he was exposed to surgeries and the sight of blood, it actually made him physically sick. And so he abandoned that, and then he went on the voyage of the Beagle.
Go to turtles.
Yeah.
I'd rather look at turtles, the Galapagos Islands, than look at that.
But it was always the problem of evil that was like deeply disturbing to him and troubling to him. But I like that you said that naturalistic evolution, because I think that's an important distinction, because there are different views on this topic. You have evolutionary creationism, which would embrace most, if not all, of Darwin's theory that evolution is kind of God's idea, also known as theistic evolution, and that through natural selection, God brings about the wonderful diversity that we see on Earth. You have young Earth creationism. We're probably all familiar with that God didn't use evolution at all. And then, of course, you have to distinguish between micro and macro evolution.
Within species.
Within species.
We used to be Homo erectus, and now we're Homo sapien. There was a caveman version of us that God breathed his spirit into, and then we became human beings, and that's when the image of God starts, all of that.
And then progressive creationism, which is like intelligent design, or old Earth creationism, that God, in a sense, is injecting new information into the system. And some evolutionists actually would argue this, that you look at the history of the globe, and there seems to be these moments, I think called punctuated equilibrium, where there seems to be something new fed into the system, some kind of information, and where Lennox would argue is like, okay, God is that source of information as the Word, and He's injecting new things into the system. But the point is, there's so many different
Stephen
ways.
Meyer has a book on that.
Yeah, he does.
The Signature in the Cell or something like that.
Yeah, it's intelligent design. Yeah, but I think it's important to identify like wherever one is on this whole conversation. We can't just like write off. Used the term evolution and equate it with atheism because there are different forms. Like there's naturalistic evolution, as you said, but then there's also the belief that God could be using a certain process to create. God is still creator. I think that's what Genesis is telling us, by the way.
Good. I think also if you come at this question and you're just absolutely convinced that the only way to read the Bible is this literal 24-hour period of Genesis, I just encourage you that sometimes we use our interpretation of Genesis as a litmus test for Christianity. Yeah. And I want to say, as someone that used to be in that camp before I really applied myself to study in depth what the Bible says, what people who study this in depth say, I think it's not fair to use this as a litmus test for whether someone is an Orthodox Christian or not.
Right.
I think with all things, we should show up to the conversation.
Yeah.
We should read people on multiple sides of the aisle, 100%. And we should really submit ourselves first and foremost to the creeds and say, what do the creeds say are ancient Orthodox teachings about what is the essence of Christianity? And let's make sure we're not just adding things onto that. Because surely the Bible is true. I believe that with all of my being. But sometimes I have to be honest, I'm not the most faithful interpreter of Scripture. And it takes me listening to a Mark, listening to a Dom, listening to people that I disagree with to make sure that the way I, Dina Davidson, am reading the Bible is actually the way that God intended it.
Yeah.
So just,
it's good.
Just a cautionary.
Yeah.
That's great. Okay, let's pivot this for the next few minutes over to the connection to the existence of God and how these two connect, of course, is on the one hand, we can sometimes use science to say there's evidence, there's pointers that God might exist, and we're going to use our brain and our rationale to kind of hunt down these evidences to God's existence. So what have been those for you? I know for me, I'll start with the kind of concept of, there's the moral argument. I'll focus on, just to segue the science piece, to the whole cosmological argument, which is basically philosophically for thousands of years, everybody, go back to the Socrates and Aristotle and Plato, everybody knew that if something begins to exist, it's called contingency. If something begins to exist, it has to have a cause. And so you began to exist at a certain time, and the reason you began to exist is because your parents, one night, it was nice, it was candles, they liked each other, and now you exist. But you had to have two people exist outside of you before you to make you exist. Everything that begins, which is a very important word, to exist has to have a cause outside of itself that caused it. So the debate and the discussion for thousands of years, we have the universe. What's the non-contingent thing? Well, it's the universe. The universe is the one thing we know. It never began to exist. You don't even need God. You just go, the universe has been the thing that's always been here. And that was enough. You could just die and think that. And then, of course, Edwin Hubble and all the science started pointing toward, wait a minute, the universe even had a beginning. Yeah. It's running out of energy, right? Entropy. We know it's a flashlight. It's the batteries burning out. And the universe is expanding. And for those of us who aren't real scientists, here's the crazy part about it, actually. Because when we picture the universe expanding, I think we picture like all the planets and the stars and the galaxies, of which there are infinite amounts, which is just crazy to start thinking about how big the universe is. We picture them like moving like together, that they're moving. But what science tells us is they're not moving. They're actually set like buttons on a balloon. And it's the universe itself that is expanding. What?
And expanding into what?
Expanding into what, Dom? I'm freaking out now. I'm up at 2 a.m. going, what's it expanding into? It's expanding out. And so once we start to realize we started doing the math, and we realized, science did, that about 15 billion years ago, from what we can tell in 2024, who knows whether this will be redacted, I'm sure there's many people trying to redact this, about that, whatever, all time and energy and matter came into existence in a single moment, and the universe has been expanding ever since. And so when we came to that conclusion, it was originally the atheists that didn't like that explanation, because what it reeked of God, they said.
There's a beginning.
There's a beginning, because now the argument is, if something begins to exist, it has to have a cause. Well, we know the universe began to exist. Ergo, the universe has to have a cause. That is one of the philosophical arguments of where science and the existence of God at least start to evidentially come together. It's not like a full proof. It's just, let me pause a little bit here and realize science is actually pointing towards something here and not taking away from something. So that was one of the things that helped me with the existence of God. You guys.
And this is the exact moment where the scientist who comes from a more naturalistic assumption is like, see, I knew it. Like, we allowed a divine foot in the door.
Right,
now
exactly.
You're just positing God's existence to answer for So I would just say, Mark, that is an explanation, but that doesn't mean you have to stop asking the question. But basically what the argument that Mark is making is really good argument, is this is the best explanation at the given time.
Yeah. Yep.
And that's all you can believe, to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah.
All you can believe is
Yep.
the best explanation at this given time. And that is the scientific method. Allow your theory to be open to revision if different evidence comes along. See, we're still doing science. It's not a God of the gaps argument.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and it's interesting to see, too, some of the answers that they are putting forward to try and give an explanation for the beginning of all things. Multiverse, that's kind of the more pop level thing now. Lawrence Krauss, a universe from nothing. And when you dig into that, what does he mean by nothing? Because that sounds like a biblical idea. And by nothing, he literally means like the laws of gravity, which Stephen Hawking wrote about. I think his last book, The Grand Design. And the premise of these books is because of quantum gravity, or some would say the multiverse, the universe actually didn't have a beginning, and it therefore doesn't have a.
It's had multiple beginnings.
It's had multiple beginnings.
There's that version too.
And it's interesting too to see like some of the back and
Answers,
forth that Lennox has had with guys like Hawking. They have had a fascinating relationship. I think Hawking may have changed his view on God because he's no longer with us. But Hawking, he once wrote an article about a decade ago, and he said in that article, quote, "Christianity is a fairy story for those afraid of the dark." And they then went
Such
to
a good quote. Like you just want to be on his side after hearing
and then
that.
Lennox, they went to Lennox, who was at Oxford at the time. They're like, "Hey, what do you think of this?" And his response was, "Well, no, atheism is a fairy story for those afraid of the light." So they've always had kind of this back and forth relationship.
Well, now I'm on your
And so then Hawking wrote that book, The Grand Design, saying gravity made it all. And then Lennox wrote a book called God and Stephen Hawking. And he basically takes him to task, saying he's wrong on three different levels. Like the law of gravity is something, right? It's not nothing. It's logically incoherent to say that X created X. And thirdly, laws by definition depend on the existence of nature. They describe reality. They don't create reality. So I think that whole notion of the gaps, as followers of Jesus, we're not just trying to fill gaps here. We believe that God's the God of the whole show. You draw a circle around all the questions and the uncertainty. Well, he is the source of all things.
With this, I feel like a really simpler answer is it's not scientific, but I do believe it is honoring of the scientific quest. And that is just going out and seeing nature. And this is an experience that humanity has had and has chronicled from the beginning of time. Is walking out and looking up at the mountains, walking out, looking up at the stars, and just sensing both through your soul as well as your mind that there is something behind this. There is something that created this grand beauty. And I would say it's a good argument for the existence of God.
Have you guys looked into the teleological argument? Because you mentioned the cosmological argument. That everything exists because there's a cause. Teleological argument, it's like the complexity and the beauty of the universe points to the fact that there must be a designer. So when you're sharing that, I thought of that psalm, heavens declare the beauty of God.
And the scientists kind of go into, with the teleological argument, go into like the chances, the mathematical probability that
This
a universe
is the
like
Goldilocks universe.
Exactly. The chances that this universe would come into existence, the mathematical probabilities are so insane that you would almost have to use the word miracle because of the amount of, to Lennox's point about laws, I've heard one writer set it up where they said there are 122 constants, and picture them as dials across a board, and they need to be zoned in, he said, to the millionth, or the minute something starts to work, a gravitational pull or a sun, whatever, the whole thing falls apart. So 122 variables need to be honed in within a millionth, and if one of them goes off one tick in the dial, everything else collapses and the universe never even begins to exist. So here's the crazy thing where my mind goes, it's like, to Lennox's point about in order for the universe to have ever come into existence, at least this is the present discussion, these constants had to work. They're laws that need to start working, which means they already have to exist before they start to work to let the universe come into being. Where are they? Where do they exist? Who's got them dialed in? Like all of these, they're not proofs, but they're at least going, theists aren't dumb.
Right.
We're not sitting around like, I just want God because I'm scared of the dark. It's like, shoot, some real scientific data is pointing toward. I start to almost become less intelligent when I'm denying the reality of theism and God, and because I'm just functioning with as nature, as you said, is the whole show. Well, if nature's the whole show, then I'm never going to be able to come up with answers about anything beyond nature. But then I'm using nature to disprove the thing that's beyond nature.
It's actually so mind-blowing. Like the sun, 93 million miles away, if it was 94 million miles away, we would have no life. If it was 92 million miles away, no life. The tilt of the Earth, it's 23.5 degrees. If it didn't tilt, we would run the risk of becoming tidally locked. Hydrogen must convert 0.007% of its mass. If that was at all different, life wouldn't exist. The atmosphere has to have exactly 21% oxygen. 22% life doesn't exist. The ocean, 3.4% salt, which is the exact percent of salt in our blood, which is interesting. But if that was changed, we wouldn't have life. I mean, it goes on and on. The expansion rate of the universe. You mentioned that. What's it expanding into? I heard one guy use the analogy of dice. Just the odds of the universe existing. Take the whole God conversation out of it. Just the odds that we're even here is miraculous. If you had dice and you roll it, the chance of getting a 6 is 1 in 6, right? The chances of getting 2 6s is 1 in 36. Each time you roll, it gets more and more unlikely. The chance of you rolling it 70 times in a row is 1 in 10 to the 55th power. Which in order to do that, you would need to roll dice for 100 trillion, 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 trillion years. That's only one constant of this whole anthropic principle being correct. So you look at these 122, the odds of us even being here are astronomical. It's impossible, really. So what is the cause of that?
You'd have to use the word miracle. And one last thing to both those points. Any other alternate belief about the beginning of the universe, like the crunch or the multiverse, the fascinating irony about all of that, and again, across the coffee table with you is that is a faith position. That's what you're saying, Dina. That's a faith position. So you want me to believe in a multiverse. You want me to believe in infinite amounts of universes to which you have no evidence. It's just a hypothetical. Because we've never gone outside of our own universe and found another one and then gone, okay, so it's 2. There might be an infinite amount of them. So there's no evidence to this. You want me to believe in an infinite amount of universes to which there is no evidence. And all I'm asking you to believe in is one person of which there is evidence, and your faith position in something you can't prove is going to make you not believe in this one of which there is some evidence toward it, and then you're critical of all faith positions. That is a faith position. And so we constantly have to be going inside of our own assumptions here and go, I do have a faith position. You always do. The reason you don't believe in A is because you've already decided to believe in B. And so at least acknowledge that and be real with it when you come to this conversation about science.
The multiverse conversation too. Like, I don't think we should be threatened by it.
No.
If someone's like,
there's aliens for sure.
Let's have that conversation. Like, maybe there is an alternate universe here that we need to unpack. But John Polkinghorne, he wrote this book called God and Quantum Gravity. And he begins to explore these kinds of ideas. Like, these questions, I think, are beautiful. If it turns out the multiverse is true, like, whoa.
Well,
maybe eternity is just the movement from one universe to the next.
100%. God is so complex and wonderful. All of this can be contained. There's no... you start poking around into quantum mechanics, and all of a sudden the conversation about miracles, where the old 1800s version of the way gravity worked, and those all old arguments. And then we're like, there's miracles. No, there's no such thing as miracles because the laws say that. It's like then you quantum mechanics, you're like, I don't know what's going on. Something tweaks on this side of the universe and it tweaks over here. And if you play, did you see this documentary? I don't even know if it's true. You could look it up on the YouTube comments. Where if you play beautiful music to water over time, they looked at it in a mic beyond microscopic, and the water like clarifies and dances. But crazy. If you play ska music to it, no, there's a documentary out there. Again, you can check whether this is factual. The water starts to turn color and actually function differently.
Wow.
I believe the documentary is called something like "What the Bleep" or so. It's all about quantum mechanics. Who the bleep are we, or what the bleep? Like literally, the word bleep is in the title. Anyway, I don't know the truth to it. I just remember reading this, watching the documentary, and it's like at the quantum level, there's things happening that we got weird dances of things that are. I was like, man, this is not threatening.
String
to
theory.
your point, it's string theory.
Yeah,
that's what the whole documentary is about. String theory. This doesn't. Oh my gosh, there's string theory. Ergo, God doesn't exist. It's like, man, he's complex and he's created this beautiful world. And when he was turning water into wine, maybe he was doing some string theory stuff and dealing at quantum mechanic levels, and it all fits.
Right.
Yeah, when we see beauty in the world or complexity in the world, it points us to the source of beauty. And I think it really encourages us to ask the question, where does even the notion of beauty come from? The colors of a sunset, the weird resonance of ska music to our molecular structure, light dancing on the leaves of trees, like hear a song that moves you, a good movie or whatever. I watched BBC Planet Earth the other day and emperor penguins jumping into a 50-foot wave. Like, all these things are amazing.
To Hans Zimmer music.
Hans Zimmer music, like it's an experience of beauty that evokes this nameless, like, yearning within us, right?
100%. Okay, guys, thank you. One last thing.
I was just saying, can we fire off quick names to keep pursuing this conversation? Like you mentioned, Plantinga, Lennox, anyone else? So you just want to say
Polkinghorne.
Alistair McGrath, specifically when it comes to the existence of God and science and religion, the history of science and religion, brilliant.
I think my last thought is, if whether you're dialoguing with someone who it comes from a completely naturalistic scientific viewpoint or more of a theistic scientific viewpoint, I think our commonality and where we can cheer each other on is we're both committed to the truth. And that's where the conversation can move forward.
It's great.
Let's both be
100%.
committed.
Love it. Okay, well, hopefully this conversation on the existence of God has been helpful to you. Join us for the next podcast.